Today we're going to talk about developing your own color sense or using your own color sense. Everybody has a sense of color, and no matter where we're painting, whether outside or from a reference, we're not copying literally. We're interpreting what we see with what we can do with the colors on our palette. And of course, the more you paint, the more you develop a sense of what you can do with the colors on your palette. And that's what we want to kind of emphasize for two reasons. It gets us away from just copying the photograph and helps us to develop a sense of color and seeing things in terms of color temperature instead of just local color. In other words, instead of seeing a red barn in the sunlight, I want to see a red-orange barn where the light hits it and a red-violet where the shadow is. So we're thinking in terms of color temperature instead of just local color, because that's where the light is, in the temperature. Also, it helps us to simplify when we're thinking of bigger shapes of color temperature that suggest the light. So I have a couple of images here. They're all somewhat in the same area. This is in Wyoming, early in the morning. And of course, the first thing we want to do is zoom in, decide what's important. This is more than half foreground. I kind of like the foreground, but you can't get everything in the painting. There's just way too much space there. So let's cut out some of the sky and a lot of the foreground. And that makes what I consider interesting, the shadowed trees, the long shadows on the grass, the barns in the background is more the focal point. Still has some interesting foreground, but now the foreground you can see is maybe a third or a quarter of the painting instead of more than half. And when I look at this, the values are pretty good in the sense that it has a lot of contrast. There's not much halftone. It's dark or light, and that creates a lot of contrast. But color is somewhat the same. It has good separation of values between the planes. The shadows down here are lighter than the vertical planes of the trees, so they're separating the planes there, the horizontal with the vertical. Values do get lighter as they go back. These kind of muted, kind of violet greens in the background stay back in the distance. But the color's a little dead. It's a little flat in the shadows, kind of the same from here all the way up to the front almost, value-wise and color-wise. So to develop or to use my color sense, what I like to see is more cool colors broken up within the shadows. I know predominantly this is going to be a bluish green, but that leaves a lot wide open. How much of a blue-green, or how close is it to green, or how close is it to blue? Am I going to add Viridian, which is also a blue-green? Or am I going to combine it with ultramarine? I could make it slightly warmer or a lot cooler, add violets to it. So there's a lot of things I can do in the shadows, as well as making it get cooler faster as it goes back. So these values and temperatures might be more like these in the background. Then the ones in the background will be even lighter and cooler. But there's not much color in this. It's kind of a real grayed, blackish violet that goes back in the distance. Using colors from the color wheel, I can represent that feeling, that sense of light and temperature, but use the colors on the palette. Same thing in the lights. It has a nice yellow green in the foreground that works, but I want to vary it a lot more. There's just no variation in color here at all. I also want a little bit of value variation. Even though it's all going to be light, I might decide this is the lightest light. Then as it goes out, it's going to get maybe just a hair darker. Still going to be very light, sunlit, but I can vary the color. And in the light yellow greens, you can go to yellow orange, reddish orange, red violet, red or orange. In other words, when I say a red orange, it can be almost orange to almost red. So you got kind of a span in there. I do want to have a basic yellow green down there to paint into, but I want to vary the color using what I can do from the color wheel with the colors on my palette. So changes here that I made, and very simple. I didn't do too much to the foreground. Got a yellow green, also adding a bit more of a green, a little bit cooler combined with the yellow green. As long as everything in the light area will be warmer in here than in the shadow, it'll work. Shadows scrubbing in, again, into a bluish green, more of a blue to blue violet. Varying the shadow color a little bit more, kind of two values of green, a real dark bluish green, and then a lighter blue-green that has a bit more yellow in it, but still blue enough that it stays in the shadow. And then pushing a cleaner violet back in here. Same thing here, a lighter violet that goes back. Allowing some of the dark of the photograph that's way too dark to come through a little bit. It kind of breaks it up. Sense of detail. Which I want to do in the painting is lay in paint that's a little bit darker than what I want. And then come back into it and lighten it up. There's some techniques I want to use in there to suggest that. Laying in darker paint in bigger, simpler areas, then coming back and lightening them up, letting some of the darker show through. So again, just a bit more stronger color. This works fine, but it is very photographic looking. I'd rather punch the color using color variations on my palette. Now this one, the sunlight gets really washed out. The shadows work a little better. Usually a camera, or at least my camera, seems to pick up, if it's going to pick up the shadows well, which I think it does. This has nice variation in the shadows. Subtle color and value changes within the shadow, but the lights get washed out. Too much white. Not enough temperature in them. So, again, I want to use colors that work better as far as a sense of color there that suggests the light better. And there's some things I really like here. The reason I took the photograph is the stream here going this way. The fence in here is a nice touch. The backlighting with the trees. And what we want to do with these trees is really emphasize the vertical shape of them. So don't wrap that light around too far. The more you wrap it around, the more it flattens the tree. So I want to emphasize the shadow more. And then just have the light a bit more on the edges. If we emphasize the light too much, then it flattens out the tree. It kind of lays down a bit too much. Also on that stream here, or probably more of just a drainage ditch, instead of having the pipe here, I'm going to go ahead and add somewhat of a bridge, a bit of a barn over here. There's some things we can do to, since there's so much green, introduce some colors that will pop out a little bit. So the changes I made here, I cooled off all the shadows a lot more, and gradually they get cooler and lighter as they go back, emphasizing cleaner color in that distant green. These greens here, again, there's a kind of a black quality to shadows and photographs, even if they're lighter. They just look dulled down by black. So I want to think in terms of mixing colors. And our palette is more pure color palette. Yellow ochre is the earth color in there, but for the most part, everything's a lot cleaner and more pure, so we should get cleaner colors. But emphasizing the yellow greens and the lights, the blue greens and the shadows, but I can vary it, adding violets. I put in some wildflowers here I thought would break up the green. But a bridge here instead of a drainage pipe sticking out, then a bit of a roof sticking up there, situated to where the sunlight would hit the roof. And some of that red really will pop out amongst all this green. Also, green doesn't look quite as green until you do introduce some red to it. And I can vary these lights quite a bit more, get more violets and the lights back in the background as well. So emphasizing the height of these trees, the fact that they're upright, they're standing up off the flat ground, making these darks a little bit bigger. I don't want to wrap the lights around. That makes the tree smaller and get a little flatter. So emphasize the strong darks on the shadows. Yeah, the greens all kind of look the same. Not much depth at all between the foreground greens and the background greens. A little bit. And I can use what I see there and then push it even more. So that the changes I want to make here are more about depth and just some color variation. Adding some blue greens. There is some yellow greens back in here. It's not like everything just has to be blue in the background. But the yellow greens are have a lot more blue in them than they would here in the foreground. So variation of blue greens, going from really bluish green to more yellow, a little bit of value change as well. And then having the yellow green and the orange mixture there in that sunlight middle ground, instead of just yellow green. chop in both. Maybe start with the yellow green and then chop in the orange. Same value, just a little bit of a color change. And same thing in the foreground, more yellow green, orange. My yellow green can vary, a bit more yellow, a bit more green. Doesn't have to be just one flat color, because we're using simpler, more pure colors, so a subtle change, a little less yellow or a bit more blue, will make a big difference. And if I can get 3 or 4 subtle color changes within this yellow green, I'm going to have a lot more variation. And again, more of a ultramarine blue and a viridian in the trees. Maybe not as much viridian or no viridian in the grass. So I got that separation of color between foliage in the trees and the grass on the flat ground, because it's too easy to get them both the same. And again, in the shadows, we can use more violets, red violets, blues, blue greens to vary it, just simply for the sake of varying color, because we're not going to see it in the photograph. Same thing with emphasizing the distance. I've added a few strokes of a dioxazine purple, or the equivalent of, and that's going to push that green back even further. So use these exercises to think through what you can mix on your palette and try and stay away from just copying the photograph. Think in terms of what you can do with the colors on your palette and push it a little bit more. Think outside the box. Make your color maybe a bit stronger. You can always knock it down once it's on the canvas. Kind of think a little bit differently in these exercises, which is what exercises are for, to stretch your painting ability. Maybe even make you feel a bit uncomfortable what you're mixing.